So right now we have just one factory that we're testing out. And what we want to do is we want to actually write tests for another factory. So we're going to have, in terms of naming here, I'm going to create another factory. And this is going to be called employee factory. So the difference between my employee factory is that my factory is actually going to make my request to my server. Again, I don't even have my server set up, but I could actually build out these tests already and set them up and then do my router later on. It would be totally fine to do that. In fact, like I had mentioned before, your server is not running, doesn't need to run when you're setting up your tests. Just your test server needs to be running. So I'm going to bring in my module here, and I'm going to create a factory. And this is going to be my employee factory. And this is going to be responsible for making my calls from my client to my backend. And the only reason why this is going to be somewhat more complicated is that what I'm going to do, and this was done in the author workshop, and you had seen it before in one of the other examples, is that I'm going to want to basically take the data that I get from the server, and I'm going to want to create my employee objects. My employee objects have the business logic in them, which right now is fairly simple, but we could always build that out. So I'm going to return this object, and this object is going to have a method called fetchAll. And just to keep it really simple here, when we call fetchAll, and we've seen this a bunch of times already, right? You've used this with Angular. Even though this route doesn't exist, we're going to say we're going to grab our HTTP and we're going to make a GET request to a yet to exist route called API employees. This ends up giving us back a promise, which gives us a result. Again, that's not our data, that's our result, because the result can have headers that you might want to look at. And all we're going to do here is we're going to return our result.data, right? That's probably, we feel confident enough with Angular to write that without anything breaking. And so let's think about how we would want to write a test to do this. So let's go back to let's save this. Let's make sure nothing broke. Okay, so nothing in there is breaking. That file's loading as well, right? It's loading all the files that are in that JS folder. And let's go back here. And let's add a child node here, and this is going to be employee factory spec. And so we're going to go over here and we're going to start out with our describe block, and this is going to be the employee factory. Again, this is what ends up making our backend calls. And we'll start off with our sanity check of it exists. So there's going to be an expectation that somewhere along the lines I've got this employee factory to be defined. And so at this point, this will hopefully load and fail because it's not defined. And we'll go up here and we'll set it up. And we could go in here, and again, we could do our before. Eventually, we could dry this out because we're putting this now in two different files. We're going to grab our app, and we're going to use our inject. Again, you'll just have to get familiar with this syntax. This takes in a function, and we're going to bring in our employee factory. So this should inject our employee factory. Let's do what we did before for our employee. And we'll say employee factory equals the employee factory. In which case we're in business here, right? This employee factory exists. We can see that it ended up running here. Again, this is just your setup work in terms of testing out Angular, where you have to inject your, get your module, and you have to inject whatever factories you want to test out. So we could write another test here, and we're going to test out, we're going to describe fetch all. And again, we'll do our sanity check here. Here we're going to expect that my employee factory has a fetch all method. You don't necessarily have to do these. I'm just sort of taking this one step at a time. And one thing that I had mentioned before, employee factory is defined and this is actually a problem that I do this periodically, is that if you don't put your it block in here, Karma gets pretty confused here. And so if you have expectations, expectations need to be in it blocks. So we'll say it is defined and now if we go back here, we should see that this is defined. What are we missing here? Here's our describe. And so here I've got a missing parenthesis, and this should pass, right? So fetch all is defined, but again, you always sort of want to start out with a broken test. Feels better to go from red to green. So we're not working with our employee at the moment. We're working with our employee factory. And so if we went over here, we could get this to fail just by saying return an empty object. Now that fails, and we go back and we're going to go from red to green. Now, what do we want to test out? Well, if we wanted to test out that it was actually calling things properly in the back end, then again, there's going to be a little bit of work that the factory is going to do, a little bit more than just fetch our objects. It's going to take these objects that will eventually be coming back from the server, and it's going to turn them into our employee objects. But what we're actually going to do here in terms of testing, we're going to say it calls /API employees. And this gets to be a little bit of setup work to test out. So what we want to do here is that we're actually going to test out that we're making HTTP calls. Now, by its nature, when you're running in your testing environment, Angular is not going to call a server, right? These are unit tests that you're writing with Angular. These are not end-to-end tests where you can actually hit the back end. As a result of that, we have the ability, what Angular ends up exposing is something called an HTTP backend. So there is this thing we can inject. And when you're not in your testing environment, this is actually, will get called and will actually make your AJAX requests. But in a testing environment, what we're going to do is we're going to bring in, set up a variable for this HTTP backend. And we'll go over here and we'll say that $HTTP backend equals _ $HTTP backend. So again, this is something that will end up getting injected, and make sure that nothing broke here, which it didn't. Now what we want to actually do here, our expectation is going to be that we want to find out that it ended up calling the correct route, and then we'll actually test out what it ended up getting back from that route. So how could we do that? Well, let's actually go in here and start setting this up. And the way that we're going to set it up is we're going to say, hey, look, backend, when you get a request for /API employees, okay, when this request ends up coming in, and actually we've got to be a little bit more specific here. It's got to know what method, right? Because this could come in from the post, it could come in from a get, but we're going to say to the backend, because again, it's not in the testing environment, right? When you're running through your mocks and the Angular mocks, which is what we're using here, we're wrapping around our actual module, but we're going to say, hey, look, when this ends up coming in, we want you to respond. What do we want you to respond with? Well, let's say that we actually are going to put in 3 employees, right? And we'll do our sort of standard whenever we're dealing with employees. We're going to have a name of Mo. Let's say Mo. Let's just set this up so that none of these guys have regions at the moment. And this is probably a little bit too much to put on here, but so I'm going to go over here. I'm going to have Mo. I'm going to have Larry. And I'll go over here, and I'll specify that I'm going to have Curly. So here are 3 things that we're going to end up sending back. What we're doing is we're really mocking the back end, right? Angular gives us the ability to do this, or I should say Angular mocks gives us the ability to do this. And we're specifying, hey, look, when this request comes in, we're going to not respond, but respond with this value. This should not, let's just make sure that nothing ended up breaking here, which it didn't. And we're also going to set an expectation. So we're mocking our back end, and we're also going to say, hey, look, by the way, you better expect back end, we are expecting a request. So again, some of these methods you have to get used to, but you can end up setting up HTTP backend has an expect get, and we say, you better expect that this is going to get called. So not only we're going to specify what happens when it does get called, but we're going to end up expecting it to get called. And real simply, we could now end up calling our request and specifying that, hey, look, we've got this employee factory. We're going to say fetch all. Okay? If we were using this factory in a controller, we would end up getting back employees. And at this point, we can actually say, what do we expect of our employees? We expect our employees dot length, and we'll use our 2 equal 3. Okay? This is almost going to work. Well, not quite. There's a couple of things we're going to have to do here. Let's just see whether or not. So nothing is really breaking here. This is passing. You might actually think that your tests are passing, but let's actually make sure that that's not happening. Let's just say that when we end up calling this, we're going to just return. And we get an error here because it's saying that we don't actually have a then. So let's actually make it fail a different way, or not fail a different way. Let's say this is going to call, we'll put an X here. Okay, now that's still passing. It shouldn't pass, right? It shouldn't pass because our test is supposed to be testing out that we're expecting this GET request. Now, one of the things that you have to do when you're testing out your GET request, and again, this comes directly from, I'm actually going to copy and paste this. This comes directly from the Angular documentation. So what I'm going to put up here is that not only can we do it before each, but we can end up doing an after each. And what I really want to do here is, since these HTTP calls are asynchronous, but our tests really are not asynchronous. But from the perspective of writing your tests, what ends up happening is that when you make a call to this mock backend, it sort of makes it asynchronous. It sort of sits up there and says, "Oh, that's great. You made a call to the backend." It doesn't really end up doing anything with it. And here, what we're going to specify is that after every test, we're going to say, "Hey, look, if there were any outstanding specifications, outstanding expectations, let's verify that there aren't any." Okay, so if you had an expectation for a GET request, let's make sure it was satisfied. Also, if you did end up making a GET request, let's make sure that it was handled. Okay, so by default, the HTTP backend, when you end up making a GET request, it's just sort of sitting up there and hanging. We could test this out. If I was to do a console log foo, let me comment this out just so you can see that. So if I go back here, this is something similar that you saw with when you were writing your server-side tests with super test, where you had to actually put a done here. So what I'm getting at here is that we're actually not testing what we think we're testing. We're never making it back in here. Okay? Now we expected this GET to end up getting called, so that's not being tested, right? We're not making it in here. But if we end up putting this little bit of code that says, "Hey, look, verify these expectations were met." Verify that if you had those expectations, they were met. Verify that you have no outstanding requests. And here we have an error. So here it actually goes in and says, "Hey, you got a problem here. You didn't tell me about this, right? I know I expected something from employees, but not employees X." So let's go back in and we'll fix that. And we'll go back here, okay? And now it's telling us, "Hey, look, I expected this request. I know you called this, but it never actually got sent back." So again, if we ended up going back in here, what's sort of going on here, again, I'm going to put my console log back here. It's still here. I never took it out. We're never making it back here. So how do we make it back here? And what I said before is that when you end up making an HTTP request from the testing environment, you have to be explicit. And you have to say, "Hey, look, backend, there's some requests that I made. Now it's time for you to go and satisfy those requests." And the way that those requests end up getting satisfied is we're going to say HTTP backend flush. Okay, so we made some requests to you. We know you're hanging on to them because things are asynchronous in the real world with HTTP requests, even though they don't have to be asynchronous here because we've told you what to respond with. You don't actually have to make a server call. But here, if we go to run this, let's figure out why that's happening here. And of course, it's happening because I have an expectation which is wrong. So I expect to get from employees. And if we go back here, at this point, our tests should end up passing. So I know that there's definitely a little bit of work here. You want to build this out slowly, but the main thing is here is that, and just also, we could see at this point, we could see our console.log foo is here. And in fact, if we went over here and we said console.log employees, we could see not employee, but employees. We could see that this is going to, should show us our employees. And let's actually test that out and make sure that that's the case. Yes, I don't know. When I ran something before, it looked like it ended up thinking I deleted a file, which I didn't delete. But so here we could see that we've got, when this happens, we're telling our backend return this dummy data. We're expecting this GET request, and the things that you have to put in here is we're verifying that there's no expectations, and also verifying no outstanding requests. If in fact we made a call to the back end, we need to make sure that we ended up flushing it, and here we end up seeing that we end up getting our employees back, and they're right here. Now, we want to have our employee object. So one other thing that maybe we want to test is that if Mo has a north region, that we want to expect employees 0, which is going to be Mo, has region north 2 equal true. Now, this is surely not going to pass because, again, this is the way that data would come over the wire as JSON data. It has no methods on it. So if we went back here, this is going to fail, and it's for a reason other than, this is a common mistake that I keep on making, missing a brace here. And it says, hey, look, has region is not a function, which is true. But the way that we want this to work with our employee factory is that our employee factory is going to be dependent upon our employee. Instead of actually just passing back our data, let's map it. So we're going to map our employee. And for each employee that we end up getting back from the server, whose route doesn't even exist at this point, we're going to return an employee of employee. So now we're basically creating our client-side objects, and we're still getting has region of undefined, and that's because we can't just call employee. We've got to say new employee. And let's just take a look. So we expected false to equal true. Here's our employee that's coming in here. So here's our name, has region of north. So let's just debug that, see if it's a problem with our test or a problem with our code. So this is really an issue of how our constructor is not taking an object. Our constructor is taking a name and regions. We could always modify that, but we could also just get this to work properly. This is an issue with our code, that we're not just passing in this employee. We're going to pass in the employee name and the employee regions. And now if we go back here, hopefully our tests will end up passing. So we could break those apart a little bit if we wanted to. We don't really have a need for, testing out whether or not we can end up, toggling regions on these objects, because we're pretty confident at this point that this in fact is an employee that we're getting back. And we wanted to have this method has region, which it has. I mean, if you really wanted to kill this a little bit, you could say we expect has region for the second employee, which is Larry. If we set that to be true, this is going to end up failing because Larry doesn't have any regions at all. So we could go in here and get this to pass by doing this. So with this video, we're able to, right here we set up Angular in this third video, test backend requests. And again, they're not backend requests, we're mocking them out. And again, we chose to, or at least I chose to set this up where my factory is returning these objects. Not all applications do it. Sometimes they just pass back the JSON data, in which case you might not have these kind of methods on them. That's totally legitimate. You'll end up seeing it both ways. But the main thing here was this whole idea that we have this back end, and the reason why it's more complicated is because these are treated as being asynchronous. So you have to say, hey, look, I made these. We know that the mocking library is tracking because fetch all ends up making that request, and we know at some point we need to basically flush this out. as a result of flushing this out, it'll end up returning this data from that mocked backend request, which ends up getting sent back here, where we end up getting our employees, and then we can end up writing our expectations. So, we have this here to say, hey, look, there's no outstanding expectations. If we expected a get, make sure we ended up getting a get, and make sure there's no outstanding requests, meaning that if our backend got a request, that ends up getting satisfied, and that's why we end up calling this flush method on the backend. So there's no calls that go across the actual wire. In fact, there can't be, because we don't even have a backend set up. But we can actually write our tests, and our tests are just focused purely on the front end code. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to move on from here, and we're going to look at testing out some of our controllers. Maybe one other thing that we could do here, perhaps there could be another method that we look at here. Maybe, in fact, we have some. So let's say if this was a CRUD application, maybe we have some method that's going to create an employee. When we go to create an employee, we're going to pass in an employee. And if this is the case, we're not going to have a get. We're going to have a return HTTP, and this is going to be a post. Where would we post to? We're going to post to employees. And what are we going to post? We're going to post our employee. In which case, we're going to get back an employee, and we probably would want to do the same thing we did before. We're going to return a new employee. And actually, this is incorrect. Let's fix this. Right, so we know that when we end up doing a post, we get a then. We're going to get back a result. Again, that's not our data yet. Our data is wrapped inside that result, because there are other things that we might want to look at. Not a status, because we know the status, but we might want to take a look at the headers. And here we'll say we're going to return a new employee, and this is going to be, we could do this in 2 steps. The employee is going to be a result dot data, and so this is going to be new employee, and this is going to be employee dot name, and this is going to be employee dot regions. So again, even without having a back end, we could go and we could test this out. So our factory has 2 methods, create and fetch all. And now let's write some methods for the create. So right now we don't have any methods for this create. Let's actually go over here, and I'm going to do a little copying and pasting just to make this a little bit easier. So here's should be my describe block. This should make sure that this passes, which it does. What I really want to do is I want to test out create. And we want to see that it's defined. So here's create. Here's our employee factory, which we ended up getting from injection. Create is defined. Right, so that also passes. And what we want to do is that this is going to call post API employees. And we'll say, hey, look, when you post to API employees, let's actually get back not an array, but just one employee. This is what we expect our backend to do. So when we end up posting our employees, we're going to pass back and assume that we ended up passing in Shep, and let's say Shep has South. And we're going to say we expect a post to API employees, and we're going to end up calling create. Now, when we call create back, we just expect to get back one employee. There's going to be no length. We're just going to have an employee. And if, in fact, we ended up creating this employee, he's not going to have the region north. So we'll set this to false. So we're going to expect post when we call create. Let's actually just set up a, we'll say this is going to be chef. So here's chef. And we're going to respond with chef. We'll assume that chef is going to be what's going to end up getting created. So we're going to call create. We're going to pass in chef. And in fact, we should see that this employee ends up getting created. And let's actually take a look. We'll test that out. Let's see. So this passes. Let's actually get it to fail, just to make sure we're testing what we think we're testing. So we'll say he doesn't have the region, or he does have the region, right? We know he doesn't. So this, again, if this test is running, this should fail, which it does, right? Expected false to be true. So here, the only difference is that we're saying, look, when we post to this route, respond with shep, we're calling create with shep, which seems a little bit silly. We know that on our back end, we're actually going to get, again, when we set this up, we're going to get an ID back, but we'll end up worrying about this when we actually set up our back end, which we're not going to actually set up until we do our controllers here. The main thing that I want you to see here is that not only can you end up setting up GET requests, but you can set up, posts and puts and deletes. There's a, HTTP backend when delete, HTTP backend when put, HTTP backend when you expect delete and put and so on. So basically for all four of those verbs, you can do any of those. And here we'll actually just specify that we know that has region north is going to be false. And here we're just making sure that the object that we get back is our employee object, and that it's got the right properties. And we'll say south is going to be true. And so all those tests end up passing, and now we've got this test suite. And again, the main thing that I want to show you here, you can see these tests are getting a little bit bigger, a little bit more complicated. Again, some of these things we can end up drawing out. We could put some things in before each blocks if we wanted to. But the main thing is to bring in this back end to set up your test so that there's no outstanding either expectations or requests that are sitting there. And the way that you end up doing that is by basically mocking out what these requests are going to be, and specify how you want to mock these out with the response, putting in your expectations, and making sure you end up flushing your back end.